The room went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not tense, frozen. The judge stopped mid-sentence, one hand resting on the file he had just opened. My parents were standing only a few feet away from me, confident just moments earlier, dressed like people who believed the ending already belonged to them. They had sued their own mother for her estate. To them it was paperwork, strategy, timing. To me it was something else entirely, a slow, deliberate erasure that had started years before anyone ever stepped into a courtroom. I had learned how to stay quiet a long time ago. I learned how to listen, how to notice patterns, how to remember details no one thought mattered. While everyone else argued loudly about money and rights, I watched doors close, signatures appear, and intentions harden. The judge didn't look at me when he froze. He didn't need to, because whatever was in that file was never meant to be seen out loud. And once it was opened, nothing, not blood, not inheritance, not carefully rehearsed, lies could put things back the way they were. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your location and local time. It helps this story travel further than you think. And if stories about quiet endurance, delayed justice, and truth finally being seen resonate with you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. I grew up learning the weight of silence long before I understood the value of money. In our house, money was never discussed openly, but it was always present, hovering over every decision, every argument that ended too abruptly. Every holiday that felt more like a performance than a celebration. My parents liked to say we were comfortable, a word they used the way some people use prayer, repetitively, defensively, as if saying it often enough would make it unquestionably true. My grandmother was the only person who never pretended. She lived 15 miles away in a modest one-story house that smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. Nothing about her life suggested excess. She clipped coupons even though she didn't need to. She reused wrapping paper. She drove the same sedan for 12 years, but she never acted small. She listened carefully, spoke slowly, and remembered things, birthdays, disappointments, small victories at school that my parents forgot the moment grades stopped being impressive. When I was 8, I learned where I mattered. My parents missed my elementary school awards ceremony because my father had a meeting. My mother sent a text apologizing and promised dinner out this weekend. My grandmother showed up early, sat in the front row, and clapped like I had just won something historic. Afterward, she took me for ice cream and asked me what it felt like to stand on stage. No one had ever asked me that before. As I got older, the contrast became clearer. My parents were generous with opinions, instructions, and expectations, but stingy with attention unless it reflected well on them. Appearances mattered. Achievements mattered. Quiet compliance mattered most of all. My grandmother didn't reward silence. She noticed it. By the time I was a teenager, I understood the unspoken hierarchy in our family. My parents spoke, decisions were made, and everyone else adapted. My grandmother existed in their conversations the way assets do, something to be referenced, planned around, and eventually transferred. They never said that part out loud, but I heard it in the pauses, in the way their voices sharpened whenever her name came up alongside words like planning, future, or legal. I didn't know what an estate was yet, but I knew tone. And their tone changed when they talked about her. Sunday dinners at my grandmother's house were where I saw the pattern form. My parents would arrive late, stay just long enough to be seen, and steer conversations toward logistics, repairs on the house, insurance policies, property taxes. My grandmother answered politely, sometimes vaguely, always redirecting back to food memories or how school was going for me. I watched my mother's smile tighten every time that happened. After dinner, while my parents stood in the driveway talking loudly about traffic and work schedules, my grandmother would walk me back inside, hand me leftovers, and slip a folded $20 bill into my pocket. Not as a bribe, not as charity, as acknowledgement. "You don't have to spend it," she'd say. "I just want you to know it's there." That sentence stayed with me. At home, money came with conditions. Allowances were tied to behavior. Gifts were reminders. "After everything we do for you," was a phrase that landed like a debt notice every time it was spoken. I learned to accept things quietly. Gratitude was expected, questions were not. With my grandmother, nothing felt transactional. She never talked about what she'd done for me. She talked about what I was becoming. When I left for college, my parents framed it as their achievement. They talked about tuition costs, sacrifices, returns on investment. My grandmother asked if I was scared. When I said yes, she nodded, like fear was reasonable. "Being careful doesn't mean being afraid," she told me, "and being quiet doesn't mean being weak." That was the year my parents started visiting her more often. At first I thought it was concern. She was older now, moving slower, forgetting small things. But the visits had a rhythm that felt off. They came with folders. They asked the same questions repeatedly. They started speaking for her in conversations with neighbors and doctors, correcting her when she disagreed. "She's just tired," my mother would say. "She doesn't always remember," my father added. But she remembered everything that mattered. I noticed how my grandmother's posture changed when they were around. How she let them talk, waited for them to finish, then responded with short, non-committal answers. She wasn't confused. She was strategic. I stayed quiet too. Not because I didn't see what was happening, but because I was learning how this family punished resistance. Every time someone challenged my parents, it ended the same way. Withdrawn support, rewritten narratives, sudden distance framed as needing space. Silence, I realized, was the only way to stay close to the truth without being forced out of it. One afternoon, while my parents were in the living room discussing something in hushed, urgent tones, my grandmother and I sat at the kitchen table. She slid a legal-sized envelope toward herself, tapped it once, and then pushed it back into a drawer. "You hear more than they think," she said, without looking at me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "Just remember," she continued, her voice steady, "people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe time is on their side." I didn't know then how right she was. I only knew that something was forming slowly, deliberately, and that whatever it wasn't built for fairness. It was built for control. And control, I was learning, always mistakes silence for surrender. My grandmother's health didn't collapse all at once. It thinned, quietly, like paper worn down by handling. At first it was small things, fatigue that lingered too long after errands, a tremor in her hand when she poured tea, appointments scheduled closer together than before. She never dramatized it. If anything, she minimized it, waving off concern with a practiced calm that told me she didn't want to be treated like a problem to be solved. My parents reacted very differently. Suddenly their visits became punctual, predictable, documented. They arrived with planners and notebooks, asked about medications, insisted on attending doctor appointments she hadn't invited them to. They framed everything as responsibility, as duty. Anyone watching from the outside would have called them devoted. I watched closer. They asked the same questions again and again, not because they forgot the answers, but because they were testing consistency. Dates, names, details. Every pause my grandmother took was noted. Every correction became evidence stored somewhere behind my father's eyes. "She repeated herself," he'd say later in the car. "She didn't remember the dosage," my mother added. "She didn't need to," I said once. "It's written on the bottle." That comment earned me a look. Sharp. Warning. I stopped commenting after that. As my grandmother's mobility slowed, I started spending more time at her house. At first it was practical, helping with groceries, driving her to appointments when my parents were busy. But gradually, it became something else. A presence. A buffer. She noticed. "You don't have to babysit me," she said one afternoon, half smiling as I sorted her mail. "I know," I replied. "I just like being here." That was the truth. Her house felt honest. Nothing was hidden, even when things weren't said out loud. The first time the word competency entered the conversation, it came from my mother. She said it casually over coffee, like she was discussing weather. "We should probably have a doctor evaluate Mom just to be safe." My grandmother didn't look up from her crossword. "Evaluate me for what for?" "Well, just to make sure everything's okay," my mother replied. "It's standard." My grandmother folded the paper slowly. "Standard for who?" No one answered. From that point on, the tension thickened. Conversations shifted tone when my grandmother entered the room. My parents spoke to her louder than necessary, slower than respectful. They corrected her memory in front of people. They started finishing her sentences. She let them. That worried me more than if she had fought back. One evening after my parents left, she sat heavily in her chair and closed her eyes. The house felt smaller without their voices filling it. "They think I don't notice," she said. "I know. They think time will do their work for them." I didn't respond. I was learning when listening mattered more than reassurance. A few weeks later, she asked me to drive her to an appointment she hadn't told my parents about. The doctor's office was modest, tucked between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner. The appointment lasted longer than usual. When she came out, she looked lighter, relieved. "They asked me questions," she said as we walked to the car. "Real ones. About dates. About finances. About decisions I've made recently." And I asked. And I answered them. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Not long after that, the legal conversations began. My parents stopped using vague language. They started naming things: trusts, power of attorney, safeguards. They spoke as if these were neutral tools, necessary precautions against chaos. They framed it as protection, but every solution they proposed placed control in their hands. My grandmother listened, nodded, asked for copies, said she'd think about it. She never signed anything in front of them. That was when the pressure escalated. They called more often, dropped by unannounced, brought lawyers' business cards just in case. My father once suggested that stress was making her confused, that simplifying decisions would be a kindness. "You don't need to worry about all this," he said. "We'll take care of it." She smiled politely. "I've taken care of myself for a long time." "Yes," my mother said, "but things change." The implication hung there. I noticed how often they excluded me from these discussions, even when I was sitting in the same room. I became invisible when it suited them, useful only when my presence validated their image as attentive children. They underestimated my silence. Late one night, my grandmother called me into the study. She had laid out papers on the desk, medical forms, financial summaries, handwritten notes in neat, deliberate script. "I want you to know what's real," she said. "Not what they say later." I sat across from her, heart, steady mind alert. She didn't show me everything. She didn't need to. She explained her intentions carefully, methodically, as if she were narrating a process rather than confessing a secret. Fairness mattered to her. Autonomy mattered more. "I'm not angry," she said. "I'm disappointed. There's a difference. I understood then that whatever was coming wasn't sudden. It was the result of years of observation, of patience, of choosing when not to act." My parents believed decline meant opportunity. They believed urgency would favor them. They didn't understand that my grandmother had already done the most important thing. She had prepared. And I, quiet, underestimated, always present, was learning exactly how dangerous patience could be when paired with clarity. The will wasn't announced. It wasn't discussed over dinner or hinted at through passive comments the way everything else in our family was. It existed quietly, like a decision made long before anyone else realized a choice was on the table. I didn't know the details at first. I only knew that something had shifted. My grandmother became more deliberate in small ways. She organized drawers that had stayed untouched for years. She labeled folders. She requested copies of documents she had already signed decades earlier. When she spoke to my parents, she listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and gave nothing away. They mistook her calm for compliance. The appointment happened on a Tuesday afternoon. She told my parents she had a routine checkup. She asked me to drive her, and I did. We didn't talk much on the way there. She stared out the window, hands folded in her lap, her posture steady. The law office didn't look impressive. No glass walls, no sweeping views, just clean lines, muted colors, and a receptionist who knew her name before she said it. That alone told me this wasn't rushed. I waited outside while she went in. An hour passed. Then 2. When she came out, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't tense either. She looked resolved, like someone who had finished something necessary, not easy. "It's done," she said as we walked to the car. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't need to. Over the next few weeks, my parents became restless without knowing why. They increased their calls, asked more pointed questions. My mother once asked too casually whether my grandmother had updated anything recently. Updated what my grandmother asked. "Oh, my mother replied. "Paperwork." My grandmother nodded. "I keep everything current." That answer satisfied them. It shouldn't have. What my parents didn't understand was that my grandmother had always been precise. She didn't act impulsively. She didn't make decisions out of spite. Everything she did followed a logic that didn't need to be loud to be firm. The will had been revised. Properly. With witnesses. With medical evaluations already completed. With video documentation that confirmed her intent in her own words on her own terms. Nothing about it was ambiguous. But my parents never imagined they'd need to worry about ambiguity. They believed inheritance was automatic. That blood translated to entitlement. That time would eventually corner everyone into agreement. At family dinners, they continued speaking as if the future were already mapped. They talked about selling the house someday, about consolidating assets, about simplifying things when the time comes. My grandmother listened without correction. I watched their confidence grow, fed by assumptions they had never bothered to verify. One night after they left, my grandmother asked me to sit with her in the living room. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock she'd had since before I was born. "I didn't tell them," she said. "I figured." "I won't," she added. "Not unless I have to." Why? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because people behave more honestly when they believe they're winning. That sentence landed heavier than anything she'd said before. From then on, the performance intensified. My parents began documenting her behavior in ways that felt unnatural. My mother took notes after visits. My father started emailing summaries just to keep everyone on the same page. They framed it as organization, but it felt like preparation. I overheard my father on the phone once, his voice low but firm. "We just want to make sure everything's handled properly. She's not the same as she used to be." He paused, listening. No diagnosis yet, but it's only a matter of time." That was when I understood they weren't waiting for clarity. They were waiting for justification. They believed the will, whatever version existed, would favor them by default. They assumed any deviation could be challenged, corrected, overridden. They underestimated how thoroughly my grandmother had anticipated that exact mindset. I stayed quiet. I focused on being present. I drove her to appointments. I helped her organize medications. I kept notes when she asked me to. I never discussed legal matters unless she initiated it. That restraint wasn't accidental. It was protective. If anyone ever claimed influence, they'd have nothing to point to. The revised will wasn't about rewarding loyalty or punishing greed. It was about balance, about responsibility, about ensuring that what she'd built over a lifetime wouldn't be dismantled by urgency and resentment. I didn't know then how central I was to it, only that my grandmother had planned with care, and that care extended beyond money. The tension reached a strange equilibrium. My parents pushed, but not openly. My grandmother deflected without confrontation. Everything remained polite, civil, brittle. At one dinner, my mother raised a toast to family sticking together. My grandmother lifted her glass, smiled gently, and said nothing. I noticed my father watching her closely, searching for cracks. There were none. What my parents failed to see was that the will wasn't the beginning of the conflict. It was the culmination of years of observation, of boundaries quietly held, of trust placed where it had been earned. They thought the document would surface eventually, and when it did, they'd deal with it. They didn't realize that by the time they discovered it, it would already be too late to change anything. Because the will wasn't designed to be defended in private. It was designed to stand in public. The lawsuit didn't arrive with a warning. It arrived as a notification. An envelope slipped into my mailbox on a Wednesday afternoon, stamped and impersonal. My name typed neatly beneath a heading that made my stomach drop before I finished reading it. Petition to determine capacity and protect assets. My parents had filed it against their own mother. They didn't tell me first. They didn't tell her either. Not directly. The court did that for them. When I drove to my grandmother's house that evening, the notice was already on her kitchen table, unfolded, smoothed flat with deliberate care. She sat across from it, hands folded, eyes steady. No tears, no shaking. Just a quiet stillness that told me she had expected something like this for a long time. So she said when I walked in, "They've decided to hurry." I sat down slowly. "Are you okay?" She nodded once. "I am. I'm disappointed, but not surprised." The petition accused her of diminished capacity. It claimed she was vulnerable, confused, susceptible to influence. It asked the court to appoint oversight to pause any changes to her estate, to investigate recent decisions made under questionable circumstances. The language was careful, polished, designed to sound concerned rather than aggressive, but the intent was unmistakable. They wanted control. What hurt most wasn't the accusation itself. It was the timing. The way they framed urgency as protection, the way they positioned themselves as rescuers while stripping her of autonomy piece by piece. My grandmother read every page, twice, then she folded the document and placed it back into the envelope. "They believe paperwork speaks louder than people," she said. "Let's see." The next morning, my parents called me. They spoke as if nothing had changed. "We wanted you to hear it from us," my mother said, her voice practiced. "This isn't an attack. It's just precaution." "For whom?" I asked. "For Mom," my father replied quickly. "Things have been concerning lately." I said nothing. "We're just asking the court to look," my mother continued. "That's all. If everything's fine, it'll be resolved quickly." "And if it's not?" I asked. There was a pause. "Well, my father said then we'll have protected her from herself." That was the moment I understood there would be no turning back. Within days, the filing became public record. Extended family members called with questions framed as sympathy. Neighbors began offering help my grandmother hadn't asked for. Whispers followed her into grocery stores, into church, into every space where people believed concern excused intrusion. My parents moved fast. They requested emergency hearings. They demanded access to financial records. They asked for evaluations to be scheduled at their convenience. They spoke with certainty like people who believed the law existed to confirm what they already knew. My grandmother's attorney responded just as deliberately. Motions were filed, documentation submitted, timelines established. Nothing was rushed. That contrast between my parents' urgency and her patience became the defining tension of everything that followed. I stayed quiet, not because I agreed with them, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that noise was exactly what they wanted. Conflict fed their narrative. Resistance could be reframed as instability. Silence gave them nothing to work with. They tried anyway. My mother showed up unannounced one afternoon while I was at my grandmother's house. She brought pastries, smiled too widely, and spoke as if this were a casual visit. "We miss you," she told my grandmother. "This whole thing has gotten so blown out of proportion." My grandmother poured tea and said nothing. "We just want what's best," my mother continued, "and the court agrees it's better to be safe." "The court hasn't decided anything," my grandmother replied calmly. My mother's smile tightened. "Not yet." After she left, my grandmother sat quietly for a long time. "They've confused movement with progress," she said eventually. "Let them." The first hearing was scheduled less than a month later. My parents arrived with a legal team that looked expensive and aggressive. They spoke confidently to reporters outside the building. They framed the lawsuit as an act of love. Inside, the tone shifted. The judge listened, asked questions, requested documentation, and then did something my parents hadn't anticipated. He set boundaries. Evaluations would be independent. Financial records would be reviewed objectively. No emergency actions would be taken without substantiated evidence. My parents' confidence wavered just slightly. Outside the courtroom, my father pulled me aside. "You don't have to get involved," he said. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns her," I replied. He studied me for a moment, then nodded as if I had proven something he already believed. "Just remember where you come from." The implication was clear. Loyalty had a price. Over the next weeks, the pressure intensified. My parents called more often, asked pointed questions, hinted at consequences. They suggested it would be easier if everyone cooperated. That drawn-out litigation would be stressful for my grandmother. They framed resistance as cruelty. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I didn't explain. I stayed present. I took notes when asked. I drove when needed. I watched carefully. Because beneath the surface of their confidence, something else was happening. Cracks were forming. They hadn't accounted for how thorough my grandmother had been, for how long she had prepared, for how little ambiguity there actually was. They believed the lawsuit would force a reckoning in their favor. They didn't realize it had already done something far more dangerous. It had invited scrutiny, and scrutiny, unlike assumptions, doesn't bend easily. My grandmother died on a quiet Sunday morning. There were no sirens, no rushed phone calls, no dramatic last words. I was sitting at her kitchen table drinking coffee that had gone cold when I noticed how still the house felt. Not peaceful, finished, like a room after everyone has left. She had gone sometime during the night. The doctor later said it was gentle, that her heart had simply stopped doing the work it had been doing for so long. I held on to that sentence harder than I expected to. My parents arrived within hours. They cried loudly, dramatically, the way grief looks when it expects witnesses. My mother collapsed into a chair, covering her face. My father paced, making calls, already asking about next steps, funeral arrangements, paperwork, timelines. They mourned her the way they had treated her, urgently, possessively, and with an eye on what came next. The lawsuit didn't pause. If anything, it accelerated. Within 48 hours, my parents' attorney filed motions to freeze the estate entirely, citing ongoing concerns and the need to preserve assets pending resolution. They requested expedited hearings. They framed urgency as necessity, grief as justification. The court granted a temporary freeze. Every account, every property, everything my grandmother had built over decades locked in legal limbo. The house became quieter after that, not just because she was gone, but because everything she had anchored now felt unmoored. My parents took control of logistics immediately. They coordinated the funeral without consulting me. They made decisions quickly, decisively, as if speed itself were proof of competence. I was informed, not included. At the service, people approached me with sympathy and questions they didn't realize were dangerous. "How are your parents holding up? This must be so hard for them." "At least everything was taken care of." I nodded, thanked them, said nothing else, because I knew nothing was taken care of. After the funeral, my parents hosted a small gathering at their house. It felt less like remembrance and more like consolidation. They talked openly about the estate, now no longer careful about phrasing. "It's just a matter of time," my father said, pouring himself a drink. "The court will see reason." My mother nodded. "Once things are settled, we can finally move forward." Forward meant something very specific to them. That night, I received a call from my grandmother's attorney. "There's something you should be aware of," he said. "You're named in several documents, not as a beneficiary in the way you might expect, but as a witness to intent." I closed my eyes slowly. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means your grandmother anticipated challenges," he replied, "and she documented her decisions carefully." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. From that moment on, my role changed quietly without announcement. I wasn't just present anymore. I was relevant. My parents sensed it before I said anything. They began excluding me more deliberately. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Emails went unanswered. When I asked simple logistical questions, my mother responded curtly, if at all. "You don't need to worry about this," she told me once. "We're handling it." Handling it meant pushing harder. They accused the attorney of manipulation, claimed the will was suspiciously revised, suggested my grandmother had been isolated, influenced, coerced, by whom was never said out loud. But the implication hovered around me like a shadow. I didn't defend myself. I didn't deny anything. I didn't react. I had learned by then that denial only sharpened their narrative. Silence let it unravel on its own. The court scheduled a full probate hearing. In preparation, both sides submitted evidence: medical evaluations, financial histories, communication logs, timelines that traced decisions back years, not months. The difference in approach was stark. My parents' filings were aggressive, emotionally charged, heavy on interpretation, and light on substantiation. My grandmother's documentation was precise, methodical, boring even. Facts usually are. As the date approached, the pressure became more personal. My father called me late one evening. "You don't have to be dragged into this," he said. "You can stay out of it." "I already am in it," I replied calmly. He sighed. "You don't understand how these things work." "I understand enough," I said. There was a pause. "Just remember," he added quietly, "this family has always taken care of its own." I thought of my grandmother alone at her kitchen table, preparing for a fight she knew she wouldn't be alive to finish. "I know," I said. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt colder than I expected. My parents arrived early, confident, composed. They avoided looking at me. Their attorney spoke to them in low, reassuring tones. I sat behind my grandmother's attorney, hands folded, expression neutral. When proceedings began, the judge reviewed the filings carefully, asked questions, clarified timelines. Then he did something unexpected. He requested the complete estate file, not just the will, but all supplemental documentation submitted over the past several years. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when my father's posture changed. "What supplemental documentation?" their attorney asked. The judge looked up. "Everything, including materials submitted but not previously entered into argument." Silence settled over the room. I felt it then, a shift. Not victory, not relief, attention, the kind that doesn't look away once it's been earned. The estate was frozen, yes, but not in the way my parents had intended, not as a pause before transfer, as a pause before examination. And for the first time since my grandmother died, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not grief, not anger, expectation. After the hearing, the pressure stopped pretending to be subtle. My parents no longer framed their calls as concern or family check-ins. They were direct now, urgent, calculated. Every conversation carried the same underlying message: cooperate or be prepared for consequences. They started with reminders. "All of this could end quickly," my mother said during one call. "The court just needs clarity." "What kind of clarity?" I asked. "The kind that shows Mom wasn't fully herself," she replied without hesitation. The words landed heavily. Not because they were cruel by then, I expected that, but because they were said so plainly, as if truth were a flexible thing. My father tried a different approach. You were close to her, he said. That makes your perspective important. Important meant useful. He suggested I submit a statement. Nothing dramatic, just observations, small inconsistencies, moments of forgetfulness. Anything that could support the idea that my grandmother had been declining when she made her decisions. You don't have to lie, he said. Just be honest. I was honest. I won't do that. Silence followed. Then the consequences arrived. My parents stopped speaking to me altogether. Not abruptly, strategically. Messages went unanswered. Invitations disappeared. Information dried up. I found out about court filings through the docket, not through them. The absence was deliberate. They wanted me isolated, uninformed, nervous enough to reconsider. Instead, it clarified everything. My grandmother's attorney warned me it would get worse before it got better. That pressure often peaked when leverage was slipping. They're trying to manufacture certainty, he said. Without evidence, he advised me to document everything. Calls, messages, dates. I already had. Weeks passed. The estate remained frozen. The judge ordered additional reviews. Independent experts were consulted. Every step slowed the process further. My parents grew impatient. They began speaking about me in their filings, not by name, but by implication. References to third-party influence. Suggestions that someone close had steered my grandmother's decisions. I read every word carefully, not with anger, but with precision. They were building a narrative. I refused to give it shape. One afternoon, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked tired, not grief-stricken, frustrated. This has gone far enough, she said, standing in my doorway. You're hurting everyone. I'm not doing anything, I replied. That's the problem, she snapped. Your silence is being interpreted. By whom, I asked calmly. She hesitated. By the court. That was a lie. The court didn't interpret silence. It interpreted records. You could help, she continued, softening her tone. We could move on. Grieve properly. This doesn't have to be so public. I thought of the judge's request. The supplemental file. The way my father's confidence had faltered. This is public because you made it that way, I said. Her expression hardened. So you're choosing sides? No, I replied. I'm choosing not to lie. She left without another word. A week later, I was formally requested to testify. Not by my parents' attorney, by the court. The notice was brief, neutral, procedural. It didn't accuse or assume. It asked. I told my grandmother's attorney immediately. He nodded, unsurprised. They're narrowing the focus, he said. You're a variable they can't control. The night before the testimony, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid of what I would say, but because I knew what I wouldn't. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't speculate. I wouldn't interpret. I would state facts, dates, conversations, actions I personally witnessed. Nothing more. In court, my parents avoided my eyes. Their attorney questioned me first, his tone polite but probing. He asked about my grandmother's health, her memory, her dependence. I answered carefully. Yes, she moved more slowly. No, she never forgot who I was. Yes, she asked for help sometimes. No, she never asked me to make decisions for her. Then, my parents' attorney tried to corner me. Did your grandmother ever seem confused about her finances? He asked. No. Did she ever rely on you to explain documents? No. Did you discuss her estate with her? Yes. There was a stir. In what capacity, he pressed. As a listener, I replied. She explained her intentions to me. I didn't advise her. Did you benefit from those intentions? I paused. Not in the way you're implying. The judge watched closely. Not my words, but how they were given. No defensiveness, no emotion, just clarity. Afterward, my parents didn't speak to me. Not in the hallway, not outside the building. They left immediately, their attorney whispering urgently at their side. Later that day, my grandmother's attorney called. The court has requested the supplemental file be entered into the record, he said. In full. I sat down slowly. What's in it? I asked, even though I already knew pieces. Medical evaluations, video statements, timelines, documentation of attempted coercion. My chest tightened, not with fear but with recognition. Everything my grandmother had prepared. The next hearing was scheduled quickly. Public. My parents had wanted resolution. They were about to get something else entirely. The courtroom was fuller than it had been at any previous hearing. Word had spread not in the way my parents had hoped, but enough to draw attention. Probate cases usually moved quietly, buried under paperwork and procedure. This one didn't. Allegations of coercion, questions of capacity, a frozen estate, and now a supplemental file, ordered into the record by the judge himself. It had all become harder to ignore. My parents arrived early again, but this time their confidence didn't sit as comfortably. My father's jaw was tight. My mother kept smoothing the sleeves of her blazer, a nervous habit she never used to have. Their attorney spoke in low, urgent tones, gesturing toward a stack of documents I hadn't seen before. Across the aisle, my grandmother's attorney sat calmly, a single binder open in front of him. No whispering, no last-minute adjustments. I took my seat behind him, hands folded, posture neutral. I reminded myself of what my grandmother had said years earlier: people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe time is on their side. Today, time belonged to the court. When the judge entered the room, settled into silence. He didn't waste time with formalities. He summarized the procedural history succinctly, then turned to the matter at hand. The court ordered the complete supplemental estate file to be entered into the record, he said. That file has now been reviewed. He paused. I have questions. My parents' attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, before we proceed, the judge raised a hand. You'll have time. Sit. The first document projected onto the screen was a medical evaluation dated nearly a year before the lawsuit had been filed. Independent, comprehensive, clear. The judge read portions aloud. Cognitive function intact. Decision-making capacity affirmed. No evidence of undue influence. My mother's face drained of color. Next came a timeline meticulously organized. Dates of legal consultations, medical appointments, correspondence. Each entry cross-referenced with supporting documentation. This timeline, the judge said, predates the petition by several months. He looked directly at my parents, which suggests anticipation, not reaction. There was a murmur in the room. Then came the video. The screen flickered and my grandmother appeared seated, composed, speaking directly to the camera. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. She spoke about her life, her values, her reasons for making the decisions she had made. She addressed potential challenges, directly naming them without accusation. If anyone questions my capacity, she said in the recording, they are confusing disagreement with incompetence. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't move. The judge watched the entire video without interruption. When it ended, the room felt different, heavier, more focused. Counsel, he said, turning to my parents' attorney, your clients allege undue influence. Yes, Your Honor, the attorney replied quickly. We believe belief is not evidence, the judge interrupted. This file contains contemporaneous documentation, medical confirmation, and recorded testimony, all executed properly. He flipped a page. It also contains correspondence indicating repeated attempts to pressure the decedent into altering her estate plans. My father shifted in his seat. The judge continued, including emails and notes taken after visits describing strategies to simplify decision-making and accelerate resolution. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. Can you explain these? The judge asked, holding up a document. Their attorney hesitated. Your Honor, context is important. Context is exactly what I'm examining, the judge replied. And the context here suggests coercion. The word landed sharply. My parents were finally asked to speak. My father stood first, his voice controlled but strained. He spoke about concern, about fear, about responsibility. He painted himself as a son, forced into an uncomfortable position for the sake of his mother's well-being. The judge listened, nodded once, then asked a single question. If your concern was her well-being, why did you file suit without notifying her directly? Silence. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. My mother spoke next. She described confusion, memory lapses, claimed she had seen signs no one else had noticed. The judge turned to the medical evaluation on the screen, which contradicts every independent assessment on record. Then he looked at me. Miss, he said, reading my name carefully. You were present during much of this period. I stood. Did you observe any coercion directed at your grandmother? He asked. Yes, I answered. The room stilled. By whom? He asked. I didn't hesitate. By my parents. There was an audible reaction, sharp, involuntary. I didn't elaborate. I didn't dramatize. I simply described what I had witnessed. Repeated pressure, attempts to isolate, language framed as protection that resulted in control. When I finished, the judge nodded slowly. "That will be sufficient," he said. He turned back to the bench, reviewing his notes. "The estate remains frozen," he announced. "Effective immediately, pending further orders of this court." My parents' attorney objected. The judge overruled him. "This court will not allow assets to be distributed while serious questions of misconduct remain unresolved," he said. And there are serious questions. My parents sat rigid, their certainty gone. As the judge adjourned, I realized something important. This wasn't the climax they had prepared for. This was the moment everything stopped moving in their favor. Not because of emotion, not because of sympathy, but because a file they assumed would never be opened had finally been read out loud in public by someone who didn't care about blood or entitlement, only truth. The days after that hearing passed in an uncomfortable quiet, not the kind that brings relief, but the kind that waits. My parents didn't call, they didn't text, they didn't send messages through relatives the way they used to when they wanted information without asking directly. It was as if silence itself had become a strategy, one last attempt to regain footing by refusing to react. The court, however, did not go quiet. Subpoenas were issued. Additional documents were requested. The supplemental file, the one my grandmother had assembled so carefully, was no longer supplemental in name. It became central. Every page was reviewed, every attachment examined, and that was when the full weight of it became visible. What the judge had seen first was only the surface. Beneath it was a record my parents never imagined would exist. The file included a series of contemporaneous notes written by my grandmother after each visit from my parents. Dates, times, exact phrases used, requests repeated after refusals, suggestions framed as concern that escalated into pressure when she didn't comply. One entry stood out to me when my grandmother's attorney summarized it. Discussed power of attorney again, declined. Told me it would be easier for everyone if I stopped managing things myself. Another suggested signing now, before things get complicated. Felt rushed, felt watched. These weren't emotional outbursts. They were observations, measured calm, unmistakably clear. There were also emails. My parents had assumed private correspondence would remain private. Instead, it formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Messages between them discussing timing leverage and how long courts usually take. Conversations about whether pushing harder now would be better than waiting. At no point did they express concern about my grandmother's wishes. Only outcomes. The most damning piece, however, wasn't written. It was recorded. A second video existed separate from the one shown in court. This one was shorter, more direct. My grandmother spoke plainly without preamble. "If this is being played," she said, "it means someone has challenged my decisions." She paused, steadying herself. "I want the court to know that I was pressured, repeatedly, by my own children. I refused. And I documented it." She named dates, described conversations, explained why she chose to prepare in advance rather than respond reactively. "I am not confused," she said. "I am prepared." When the judge watched that recording privately, he requested a status conference immediately. My parents arrived late that time, not dramatically, not apologetically, just slightly late, like people testing whether rules still applied to them. They sat when told. They waited when told. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This court has reviewed extensive documentation," he said evenly, "including materials that indicate a pattern of attempted coercion prior to the decedent's death." My parents' attorney began to speak. The judge stopped him. "I am not interested in argument at this stage," he said. "I am interested in facts." He listed them. Medical evaluations contradicting claims of incapacity. Legal procedures followed correctly. Recorded statements demonstrating intent. Written documentation of pressure. Then he asked the question my parents had been avoiding since the beginning. "Why did you believe this file would not be reviewed?" The room went still. My father's face flushed. My mother stared straight ahead, lips pressed together. Their attorney spoke carefully. "Your Honor, we did not believe." "You believed," the judge interrupted, "that this would resolve quietly. That assumptions would carry more weight than documentation." He leaned forward slightly. "This court does not operate on assumption." That was the moment I saw something break, not explosively but permanently. My parents had built their case on confidence, on the idea that authority belonged to those who acted first and loudest, that family dynamics would be invisible to the law. They were wrong. The judge ordered a forensic review of communications and financial activity leading up to the lawsuit. He referred specific findings to a separate inquiry regarding potential abuse of process. The estate remained frozen, not temporarily, indefinitely. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Not many, but enough. My parents declined to comment. I walked past without stopping. Later that evening, my grandmother's attorney called me. The judge has scheduled a final hearing, he said. Public, full record. I sat quietly for a moment. What happens then? I asked. That depends, he replied. But the court is no longer deciding between two stories. I knew what he meant. This wasn't about who sounded more convincing. It was about what could be proven. In the days leading up to the final hearing, I revisited memories I hadn't examined in years. Moments that felt small at the time but now fit together with unsettling clarity. The way my parents always spoke for my grandmother when others were present. The way they reframed her independence as stubbornness. The way urgency replaced patience the moment money entered the conversation. They had mistaken proximity for permission. The night before the hearing, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Not because I expected a specific outcome, but because I knew something irreversible had already happened. The truth was no longer private. It had been entered into the record. And records, unlike people, do not forget. The final hearing took place on a Friday morning in a courtroom that felt too bright for what was about to happen. Sunlight poured through tall windows, cutting across the polished floor in long, clean lines. It made everything feel exposed, honest. There would be no corners to hide in today. My parents arrived separately this time. My father came first, his expression unreadable, his suit immaculate. My mother followed several minutes later, her movements precise, controlled, like someone holding herself together through muscle memory rather than calm. They didn't sit together. That detail didn't go unnoticed. The gallery filled, slowly extended family members, a few local reporters, people drawn less by scandal than by curiosity. It wasn't a spectacle, but it was public, exactly as my grandmother had planned. When the judge entered, he carried no visible emotion. He greeted the attorneys, took his seat, and opened the file that had grown thicker with every passing week. This hearing concerns the disposition of the estate, he began, and the conduct of the parties involved. He paused, eyes scanning the room. It is not about family feelings, he continued. It is about legal responsibility. The first hour was procedural, summaries, clarifications. The court entered findings from the forensic review into the record. Communications were authenticated, timelines confirmed. Then the judge addressed my parents directly. This court finds that the decedent possessed full legal capacity at the time of executing her estate documents, he said. That finding is supported by medical evaluations, legal testimony, and recorded statements. My mother closed her eyes briefly. The court further finds, he continued, that there is substantial evidence of repeated attempts to influence, pressure, or override the decedent's decisions. My father's hands tightened on the edge of the table. These attempts, the judge said, were not isolated. They formed a pattern. The room was silent now. No murmurs, no movement. The judge turned to the attorney representing my parents. Your clients initiated litigation, alleging incompetence. That allegation was unsupported. Moreover, evidence suggests the litigation itself was used as leverage. He let that settle. Such conduct raises serious concerns. My parents' attorney stood, voice measured. Your Honor, my clients believed they were acting in good faith. Belief, the judge interrupted calmly, is not immunity. He then did something I hadn't expected. He addressed me. Miss, he said, you chose not to intervene publicly until asked by the court. Yes, I replied. Why, I considered the question carefully before answering. Because anything I said before the facts were reviewed could be framed as bias, I said. I believed the documentation would speak for itself. The judge nodded slowly. It did, he said. He returned to the bench and began reading the court's decision into the record. The lawsuit filed by my parents was dismissed in its entirety. Gasps rippled through the room, quick, involuntary. The judge continued. Furthermore, this court finds that the plaintiff's conduct warrants sanction. My mother looked up sharply. Legal fees incurred by the estate as a result of this litigation will not be reimbursed to the plaintiffs, he said. In addition, the plaintiffs are hereby disqualified from serving in any fiduciary capacity related to the estate. That was the moment everything changed. My father stood abruptly. You can't. Sit down, the judge said firmly, but without raising his voice. My father hesitated, then sat. The judge wasn't finished. Based on the totality of evidence, he said the court finds that the plaintiff's actions constituted an attempt to override the decedent's clearly expressed intent. He paused. As such, the court orders that the estate be distributed strictly according to the decedent's final, uncontested documents without modification. The room felt suspended in that moment. The judge closed the file. This matter is concluded. The gavel struck once. Clean, final. My parents didn't look at me. They didn't look at each other either. They gathered their things slowly, deliberately, like people afraid that any sudden movement might draw attention they could no longer control. Their attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but neither of them responded. I remained seated. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't triumphant. I felt steady. Outside the courtroom, reporters asked questions. I declined politely. This wasn't a story I needed to explain. The record already existed. My parents left through a side exit. Later that afternoon, I returned to my grandmother's house, the one place that still felt grounded. The estate would be settled soon, but the house remained untouched for now. Her chair was still by the window. Her books still lined the shelves in careful order. I sat at the kitchen table and let the quiet settle around me. For years, my parents had believed silence meant compliance, that endurance meant weakness, that patience meant permission. They were wrong. Silence had been my shield. Documentation had been my grandmother's. And the law, slow, deliberate, impartial, had done what it was designed to do. It had listened, not to the loudest voices in the room, but to the truth that had been waiting, carefully preserved for the right moment to be seen. The ruling didn't echo the way movies make it seem. There was no dramatic collapse, no shouting, no final outburst that gave anyone the satisfaction of a clean ending. Instead, there was a slow, uncomfortable unraveling that followed my parents out of the courtroom and into the weeks that came after. Consequences, I learned, are rarely loud. They arrived in the form of letters first. Official notices confirming the dismissal. Itemized statements detailing legal fees my parents were now personally responsible for. Formal language that didn't care how convinced they had once been of their own righteousness. My parents didn't call me when those letters arrived. They didn't call when extended family members started asking questions, either questions they could no longer answer with confidence or deflection. The narrative they had relied on for so long had collapsed under scrutiny, and without it they seemed unsure how to speak at all. The estate moved forward exactly as my grandmother had planned. Her attorney contacted me a week after the ruling to explain the next steps. There would be no delays now, no negotiations, no reinterpretations. The court's order was clear, and there was no legal room left to maneuver. My parents were no longer part of the process. They weren't consulted. They weren't informed beyond what the law required. They had no authority, no leverage, no access. Years of certainty had dissolved into silence they could no longer control. I didn't feel satisfaction in that. What I felt was distance, a quiet, necessary distance. As the estate was settled, pieces of my grandmother's intentions revealed themselves in ways that surprised even me. She hadn't designed her will to reward or punish. She had designed it to protect. There were provisions for charities she had supported quietly for decades. Scholarships for students from backgrounds like hers. Funds allocated to ensure the house would be maintained, not flipped, not stripped for quick value. And there were boundaries. Clear ones. My parents were not named as beneficiaries beyond a modest fixed amount that could not be contested or expanded. It was enough to acknowledge relationship, not entitlement. Enough to prevent claims of exclusion, but not enough to enable control. I understood then how deeply she had thought this through. She hadn't acted out of anger. She had acted out of clarity. When my parents finally did reach out, it wasn't with apology. It was with confusion. My mother sent a short email carefully worded asking if we could talk sometime. No acknowledgement of the lawsuit. No mention of the ruling. Just an implication that things could return to some version of normal if we avoided uncomfortable subjects. I didn't respond. My father tried a different approach weeks later. A voicemail. His voice restrained, almost formal. I don't understand how this went so far, he said. We were just trying to do what we thought was right. I listened to the message once, then I deleted it. Understanding requires honesty. He wasn't ready for that. The distance between us grew not through argument, but through absence. Family gatherings went on without me. Holidays passed quietly. Information stopped flowing in both directions. It wasn't dramatic. It was final. In the months that followed, I spent more time at my grandmother's house, not because I needed to manage anything the estate was already in motion, but because it felt like the right place to process what had happened. I found notes she had written and never shared, small reminders taped inside cabinets, lists tucked into books, evidence of a life lived deliberately even in its quietest moments. One note, folded carefully inside a legal folder, caught my attention. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't dated. It simply said, "Truth doesn't rush. It waits to be invited." I thought about my parents then, about how much energy they had spent trying to force outcomes, how urgency had driven every decision, how they had mistaken motion for momentum. They had believed that acting first meant acting right. The court had shown them otherwise. As the final transfers were completed, the estate attorney asked if I wanted to take on any formal role moving forward, oversight of certain charitable funds, coordination of long-term maintenance for the house. I agreed to some, declined others. I wasn't interested in replacing control with control. I wanted stewardship. That distinction mattered to my grandmother. It mattered to me, too. The last legal document was signed on a rainy afternoon. No ceremony, no witnesses beyond what was required. Just a pen moving across paper, closing a chapter my parents had tried to rewrite. When it was done, I sat alone in my car for a long time. I didn't cry. Grief had already passed through me earlier quietly, the way my grandmother would have preferred. What remained wasn't sadness, it was clarity. I understood now why she had trusted silence more than argument, why she had prepared instead of confronting, why she had chosen documentation over defense. She hadn't needed to win in the way people usually define it. She needed the truth to stand when she no longer could. And it had. My parents lost something that day, but it wasn't just money. They lost the authority they believed came automatically with blood. They lost the narrative they had relied on to justify control. They lost the ability to define what had happened in their own words. They were left with the record. And the record didn't lie. Neither did I. The silence that followed the settlement was different from the silence that had come before. Before, it had been tense, strategic, weaponized, full of things left unsaid because saying them might have slowed someone down. Now it was clean, honest, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm has passed and the air finally remembers how to breathe. The estate was no longer a subject of discussion. It had become a fact. Checks were issued, titles transferred, trusts activated. Everything happened methodically, without drama, exactly as my grandmother had intended. There were no appeals, no last-minute objections, no backroom negotiations. My parents didn't contest the outcome. They couldn't. The court record had sealed that door permanently. What surprised me wasn't their silence, it was how quickly the world adjusted around it. Extended family members stopped calling. Neighbors stopped asking careful questions. The story, stripped of speculation, lost its energy. Without scandal to feed it, it faded into what it always should have been, a legal matter resolved by evidence. Life moved on. Mine did too. I returned to work, resumed routines, answered emails that had nothing to do with court dates or filings. I found comfort in ordinary things again. Grocery shopping without checking my phone, evenings without replaying conversations in my head, mornings that didn't begin with a knot in my chest. But some changes lingered. I no longer expected reconciliation. That wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. My parents and I existed now on opposite sides of a boundary that hadn't been drawn in anger but in truth. They had shown me who they were when pressure was applied, what they valued, what they were willing to justify, what lines they were prepared to cross if they believed the outcome deserved it. I had believed them. And once you believe someone, you stop needing explanations. Months later, I stood in my grandmother's house on a quiet afternoon, sunlight filtering through the same windows it always had. The house hadn't changed. Not really. The same creak in the hallway floor, the same faint scent of lemon cleaner, the same chair by the window where she used to sit and watch the world without trying to control it. I sat there for a long time, not remembering the lawsuit, not replaying the hearings, just sitting. I realized then that justice hadn't arrived as a dramatic moment. It hadn't felt like victory. It had felt like alignment, like something that had been crooked for a long time had finally been set straight. My grandmother hadn't won because my parents lost. She had won because she had been believed. Believed by the law, believed by the record, believed even when she was no longer there to speak. And in that belief, she had given me something more valuable than inheritance, She had shown me that endurance is not passivity, that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of authorship, that you don't need to announce your strength for it to be real. I thought about all the moments I had stayed quiet when my parents spoke for her, when they reframed concern as control, when they tried to recruit me into their certainty. At the time, it had felt like survival. Now I understood it had been preparation. Silence had kept me out of their narrative long enough for the truth to stand on its own. I eventually decided to move out of the house. Not because it held pain, but because it had done its work. The charitable funds my grandmother had set up were already supporting people she would never meet: students, families, individuals whose lives would be steadied by her foresight in ways they might never fully understand. That felt right. Before I left for the last time, I found one more note tucked inside a book on the shelf. It was written in the same careful handwriting, the ink slightly faded. "You don't owe anyone your voice," it read. "Use it only when it matters." I folded the note and kept it. My parents never asked about the charities, never asked about the house, never asked what I had kept or what I had given away. Their silence was not peace, it was avoidance. And that was fine. Some relationships don't end with confrontation. They end with clarity and distance, and that distance becomes the most honest version of respect left. Today, when I think about what happened, I don't think about the courtroom or the judge or the moment the file was opened. I think about my grandmother at her kitchen table writing notes no one else would see, preparing for a future she knew she wouldn't be part of but still cared deeply about. She didn't fight loudly. She documented. She waited. And when the moment came, when the law finally looked closely enough, everything she had endured quietly became undeniable. That's the kind of justice that lasts. Not because it punishes, but because it tells the truth and lets the truth stand even when everyone else expected it to disappear. There's a quiet lesson hidden inside this story, one that real life teaches slowly, often painfully. Not every injustice needs a loud response. Not every truth needs to be shouted to survive. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is endure without surrendering who you are. To observe instead of react. To document instead of argue. To trust that truth, when preserved carefully, has a way of standing on its own, even when the people who need to hear it most refuse to listen. We live in a world that rewards speed, noise, and dominance. But life doesn't always work that way. Some victories belong to those who wait, who prepare quietly, who don't let bitterness turn them into someone they don't recognize. Strength isn't always visible in the moment. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to fight because you know the truth will eventually do that for you. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of a moment when you stayed quiet, when you were underestimated, when you chose dignity over confrontation, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and what part of this story stayed with you the longest. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about quiet endurance, delayed justice, and standing tall without becoming cruel, consider subscribing to the channel. You're not just watching a story. You're part of a space where voices that were once ignored are finally heard.